Hello CHN team, and thank you for joining us today for an overview of the PDGM and the impact it will have on your practice. We will also take this time to go over the OASIS D-1 update. The objectives of this presentation is to help you understand the basis of PDGM so that you can build off that knowledge. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to explain at least 3 changes from the current PPS payment system to the future PDGM system. The changes from OASIS D to OASIS D-1 will be understood, and strategies will be reviewed on what you should incorporate into your practice for success. Before we go any further, let's talk about what has not changed. PDGM makes no changes to the 60-day clinical episode certification, so those are your start of cares and your recerts. The plan of care will remain for 60 days, and your recert will still need to be completed within the 5-day window. Also, the face-to-face requirements will remain the same. So what is PDGM? Well, it is short for Patient-Driven Groupings Model. This model is a major change that will be happening to our industry on how we get paid come January 2020. In this new model, the payment will change to a 30-day period of care instead of a 60-day episode of care. It is also a value-based payment system, which means it encourages value over volume and removes incentives to provide unnecessary care. All of this will affect how you develop your patient's plan of care and how you deliver care. As mentioned before, and probably the most significant change from our current model to PDGM, is the change from a 60-day home health episode with one 60-day payment period to a 60-day home health episode with 2 30-day payment periods. This OASIS time point will be known as a Request for Anticipated Payment, or RAP. The reason why CMS made this change was that they found that 28% of patients were off service in 30 days or less, which meant they were paying more for the resources over a 60-day episode, whether the patient was front-loaded or not. In this model, the payment given will reflect what the patient actually needs. The LUPA threshold will also change with this model. Each 30-day period will get assigned its own LUPA threshold, depending on the payment group that it was assigned. The LUPA thresholds will range from 2 to 6 visits. Visits that are made under the LUPA threshold are paid per visit, and visits that are over the threshold are paid the case mix adjusted 30-day payment rate. Under the PDGM, the payment will rely on patient characteristics and other patient information from home health claims and from our OASIS answers. It then places them into 4 payment categories. These categories are broken down into colors in this diagram. The admission source and timing is in blue, and that depends on whether your patient comes from a community or an institutional source. Timing accounts for whether the period of care is considered early or late. Second is the clinical grouping, which is shown in orange, and this reflects the primary reason the patient is receiving home health services. So in other words, it's the primary diagnosis. In green is the functional impairment level. This reflects the level of functional impairment identified through your responses to certain OASIS items. Fourth and finally is the comorbidity adjustment, which is represented in gray, and this accounts for whether there are certain comorbid conditions present that affects resource use. In other words, this is where we put the secondary diagnoses, and depending on certain combinations, they will be grouped into one subcategory: none, low, or high. I know, this is a lot of information. Let's dissect these sections further so that what I'm saying makes more sense. An admission source can either be institutional or community. This depends on where your patient was for the past 14 days. On start of cares, institutional could be someone coming from an inpatient acute care hospital, from a skilled nursing facility, long-term care hospitals, inpatient rehab facilities, or an inpatient psychiatric facility. Typically, the admission source and timing for the first 30-day period at your start of care will be considered institutional, unless it's coming from an MD referral, which in that case, it would be considered early community. Most payment periods after the initial 30 days will be considered community. It is important to note that post-acute facilities are only institutional for the first 30-day claim on admission. After that, they would be considered community. CMS rationale for breaking it down this way is that they found that 30-day periods with an institutional admission source had a higher resource cost than 30-day periods with a community admission source. The timing of a 30-day period can either be early or late. The first 30-day period is classified as early. After that, all subsequent 30-day periods are classified as late. In most cases, the bulk of the episode payment will be in the first 30 days. Late 30-day periods are always classified as community, unless there is an acute hospital stay in the 14 days prior to the 30-day period. Each follow-up assessment is grouped into one of 12 clinical groups based on the patient's principal diagnosis. Principal diagnosis provides information to describe the primary reason for which a patient is receiving home health services. The functional impairment level is based on 8 OASIS answers. This is similar to the current payment system, which also uses certain OASIS items to determine the functional domain of the case mix adjustment. Based on your OASIS assessment items and the resources that was used over the 30-day period, the functional impairment is generated and grouped into one of 3 levels of impairment: low, medium, or high. Finally, the last step in the PDGM case mix adjustment is the comorbidity group. Currently on the OASIS, we are instructed to designate 1 principal diagnosis and up to 5 secondary diagnoses. With the new PDGM, you will designate 1 principal diagnosis and up to 24 secondary diagnoses. Depending on the patient's secondary diagnoses, a follow-up may receive no comorbidity adjustment, a low comorbidity adjustment, or a high comorbidity adjustment. No comorbidity adjustment would occur if there were no recorded secondary diagnoses that fall into either a low or a high comorbidity adjustment group. To receive the low comorbidity adjustment, there is a reported secondary diagnosis that is associated with a higher resource use. To receive high comorbidity adjustments, there are 2 or more reported secondary diagnoses associated with the higher resource use when both are reported together, compared to if they were reported separately. That is, 2 diagnoses interact, resulting in a higher resource use. Okay, let's move on to OASIS D-1. Beginning January 1st, 2020, OASIS D will be OASIS D-1. The changes include an addition of 2 existing OASIS items to the follow-up assessment. That is, the risk for hospitalization, or MOOD 1033, and the grooming question, or MOOD 1800. Also, data collection at certain time points, like on research, will have 23 existing OASIS items that will now be optional. I'm sure this sounds like music to everyone's ears. Home health agencies will be able to enter an equal sign for these items. This is a new valid response for these items, but the items themselves will not change. Different agencies may have different policies for when you can put this equal sign, so I won't elaborate on this further, but just know that this is good news. Lastly, there will be no revised version of the OASIS D Guidance Manual for 2020. Here are some PDGM key points for you to take home. The admission source and the timing is very important. An institutional source usually generates more money than community source. The number of therapy visits will no longer determine the reimbursement. But it is important to note that the PDGM model does not eliminate the need for or dismiss the payment of therapy services. Instead, the case mix items such as the primary diagnoses, the functional impairment level, and the comorbidity adjustment will account for the multidisciplinary patient needs. The LUPA threshold will range from 2 to 6 visits per each 30-day period. The primary diagnosis drives the episode, and the secondary diagnoses, which are the comorbidities, may contribute additional dollars. Staying on top of these changes and OASIS time points can be a challenge while managing patient care and daily priorities. So here are some strategies to help you feel successful during this transition. The first and probably most important tip is to make sure that there is strong communication between you and the office staff to make sure that you have all diagnostic and clinical information from the referral so that you can accurately assess your patient's needs. Thorough documentation will be essential as it helps coders understand the whole picture and choose the appropriate diagnostic codes to represent your patient. Understanding how to properly answer your OASIS questions will be important as the functional impairment level will be generated from your OASIS answers. It is critical for the care team to talk to each other to ensure everyone is working on the same goals without providing duplicate services. Doctors, patients, and caregivers should be kept in the loop to ensure that the complete clinical picture is understood and encourage patient cooperation. Front-loading is considered best practice to avoid LUPAs and rehospitalizations. Providing more visits in the first few weeks of the home health episode allows nurses to maximize teaching opportunities, provide surveillance, and identify issues early on. This will decrease the chances of rehospitalizations and LUPAs. Also, telehealth can help provide a cost-effective alternative to in-person visits. Being able to make sure that you are only making visits to the home when they are necessary and using technology whenever you don't have to be there will be helpful. And lastly, with an increase in OASIS time points, that means that missing a window can happen more easily. Finding a system that works to keep track of your OASIS time points will help you stay organized and delegate appropriate patients. My personal tip is to use the calendar that is attached to your agency's email as a way to stay on top of your OASIS time points and windows. This was a strategy that I used when I was managing a heavy caseload, and I found that it was very useful. This wraps up our video. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you found this information to be helpful.